Hello and welcome to the show. Okay, so today I've been studying nudge theory and how it responds to... The title of the paper I was reading was called Influence and Resistance of Nudges on Decision Making in Professionals. So, as the title suggests, by Brocchi et al. 2023. So, as the title suggests, the focus of the paper was about nudge theory and how professionals behave with it. So the idea was written from a neuroscientific perspective, and I managed to get, I'd say, let's conservatively say 10% of the way through, because I found quite a lot of the mentions to nudge theory in basic sort of what they were testing as metrics of consumer engagement, affective state, valence and salience, and I spent quite a bit of time looking at Wikipedia just to cover my bases, figure out, okay, so that's what this is, that's what that is, getting more into the history of it, and got myself I wrote about 2 and 3/4 pages A4, so I've done a fair bit of studying there. Pardon me. Which for one of the first days of the new study system I'm not upset about, because I didn't get to the library until 11:15 or so, which is in part because the bus is from Jiu-Jitsu in the morning, but I have Jiu-Jitsu competition training for that, so focusing on that is absolutely paramount at the moment. And I have a new car to collect on Wednesday. So, what I learned today was mostly that nudge theory is a very useful premise for developing behavioural reinforcement, but it's not a substitute for direct action. The part of the paper that, granted I didn't get too far into it, but let's be direct about what was going on, was I found that the most useful part of the paper for me was defining the difference between direct and indirect action. So, in my note-taking, I focused on the history of it all and got into von Neumann and Mortiberger. I should get that notebook. I have my little notebook there. I have my big notebook here. I have my middle notebook, which might solidify ideas and after. So, got that there, got this here. There's von Neumann and Morgenstern. So, 1944. So, yeah, 1944, von Neumann and Morgenstern were developing a book that was 1944. They released a book called Theory of Games and Economic Behaviour, which served as a premise for game theory to be developed. And if you know anything about nudge theory, you know that its relevance with game theory is quite significant. If you don't know about the two of those, essentially game theory is a mathematical set of principles studying decision making in its most broad definition. There is also decision theory, which I don't know as much about, and the literature seems to focus on game theory as, I would say, heuristic as well as the rubric, really. And in some sense you could argue they're very, very similar, because a heuristic leads to a rubric. So, as always, I have my trusty notepad in front of me. So notepad, notebook, there we go. Heuristics and rubrics. So, for new viewers, this is a active study session, and I will be speaking out loud everything that I'm writing about as I go about it, and making sure that everything I'm writing in my notepad speaks of either a generalism that I'm using as an encoding rubric, or something more specific as it pertains to my studies. So, for instance, so I'm a marketing major. If you're in the US, in the UK, I'm studying marketing. Pardon me. And I've decided to look more and more into how digital technologies are influencing human behaviour, because the scale at which it's happening is, well, quite frankly, unprecedented, to use a very ambiguous term. However, the more specific we get into that, we can see how marketing as a principle has evolved for more than simply being a means by which businesses communicate their intentions to customers, and more about how businesses can become effectively social engineering. And when I come upon ideas that I have not yet sufficiently encoded, I reinforce them. So businesses becoming social engineering institutions, organizations, go with institutions for now, or organizations. Doesn't feel quite right. Business becoming social engineering collectives. Go with organizations. So, as I'm sure many of you are very aware, that word choice is imperative in academic literature as well as it is in day-to-day life, because when we select the correct word, we not only validate our semantic encoding of either the linguistic, semantic, syntactic interface through which we communicate such an effect, aka we learn what the word really means to us. He says, as he moves his queen out of harm's way, we also can give ourselves opportunity to encode data in specific networks. So a way to think about that is, because data can be encoded in specific networks cerebrally, cognitively I guess, we provide ourselves with the basis of how do I say it? A vernacular within a vocabulary. And because we can give ourselves a vernacular within a vocabulary, we can effectively design systems within systems, which could arguably be called an endogenous system. So this is all, in my head, it's all very clearly connected. So if this is not, I've studied this chess algorithm with my personal study system, as well as it goes like throughout my jiu-jitsu system. Everything goes towards the omoplata. So if you're familiar with jiu-jitsu, again, these seem like tangents, but if you imagine that's the hypotenuse, this tangent comes to an opposite and links back in, which for me helps massively, and for you, hopefully, either educational or entertaining, or the vaguest thing, providing some sort of respite from whatever pain you're avoiding by being on YouTube. Okay, so the idea with it all leading to a specific end goal, for instance with chess, would be checkmate. So whichever opening you familiarise yourself with, eventually you get an idea of what the middle games look like, and eventually what the end games look like. In the same way that when you're playing jiu-jitsu, you might find that if you're going either from guard or from top, if you want to get to, as my favourite submission is the omoplata, from guard it's obviously significantly more obvious, and it's typically where it's taught from because of the leverages at work. It's also reasonably simple to get it from a mounted position once you understand the leverages of moving a training partner onto their side rather than flat on their back, as well as in a transition from, say you were going for a hip bump sweep and they pitched up, and you could either convert their posting into a kimura or an omoplata, in whichever order you prefer, as well as continue locking the kimura to secure. Oh, hello. to secure a trigger letter. I have a message chat. I am here. Do you have a question? Okay, respond in your own time. So, as I was saying, when you start thinking about things in terms of systems, it makes it much easier to encode all the data streams into one coherent narrative. Oh, I enjoy your bus journey. Are you on your way home from school or training or work or a friend's house? And yeah, as I get better at encoding the various data from the streams into a semantically encoded decision tree, I get a better idea of what specifically is most salient to me and my decision-making process, as well as what's relevant in the literature. So for instance, with specific words such as organisation, it starts piecing things together in a more coherent narrative, which I will now, because I tend to put things in triples because of it. Honestly, I began with Nikola Tesla speaking how the universe, if you want to understand the energies, frequencies and vibrations, you think in 3, 6s and 9s. It's also, the more I understand number theory and various sequences, the more I find that the specificity of how I encode things matters. So for example, organisations in terms of the cybernetics of business and or anything else to do with school. Drinks around. I don't have Twitch open whilst I do this. I have the stream chat open simply because I'm focusing on chess and studying. So feel free to chat in the chat. Did you enjoy your time with your friends? My intentions with the Twitch stream are, if there's anything you want to chat to me about more seriously, then mention what it's about in this chat and I'll decide if I want to open contact. For me, this is, I wasn't expecting many viewers, so yeah, just carrying on. Cool. Great fun. I'm going to continue studying. If there's anything specific you want to chat about, can you just say it in the chat and I'll get to it when I get to it. Okay, so semantic encoding of organisations when it comes to businesses or schools or sports teams or anything of that nature is the same idea as with chess having pawns and pieces, because they are technically an organisation that is working against an opposing organisation in the same way that jiu-jitsu you have yourself and your teammates against your opponents, whether it be in the more cooperative sense, maybe convivial sense as well, of just training or you're at a competition. It's the same idea of you are all working together, but there will obviously be rivalries, friendly rivalries within that same organisation, because when you're at work there will be the people who are there just to earn a paycheck, and there are the people who want to work hard and see how much they can achieve and how far they can go in life and everything of that nature. And I feel it's really important to understand that no matter which side of the dichotomy you feel most comfortable with, ultimately you have to make that decision for yourself. And when it comes to encoding data, I think whichever learning structure you find the most useful, for instance the triples that I just had there between chess, jiu-jitsu, marketing, is a way that I can reinforce the neural tracks by virtue of cell assembly theory by Donald Hebb, which was, I wrote somewhat recently. It's somewhere in here. Organisation of Behaviour was the book. I don't remember exactly when it was written. I have it somewhere on my laptop actually. Organisation of Behaviour. So get that in there. Oh, I know where it is. It's another notebook. Okay, so with the idea of organisation of behaviour as a consistent viewpoint from which to organise everything, we can look at Donald Hebb's idea which later became known as Hebbian plasticity or neuroplasticity, and more formally as cell assembly theory, as a very multimodal learning system. So, multimodal learning system, whichever way you're looking at it, if you can systematically encode data, then you can optimize the neuroplasticity available to you and develop a more efficient, optimized way of living. And for me, it's become very, very helpful because I can better identify my affective states and recognize what emotions are helping me move forward in life, what emotions are hindering me, as well as I've gotten stronger at identifying when I feel emotionally vulnerable. So without a specific valence to it, the emotional vulnerability that I've identified as a result, as a consequence of actively engaging with cell assembly theory, and there's accompanying ideas to that, is I first found it through cell assembly theory. It's supported in principle by the idea of dialectical behavioural therapy and neurolinguistic programming, and even in New World speak of law of attraction, which I think, honestly, I think if you look at law of attraction as a heuristic to aid the development of of neuroplasticity, you provide yourself an additional perspective to look at the same information, in the same way that if you wanted to learn Latin, reading French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian and Spanish, I think Romanian, those 5 languages would help you gain different perspectives on how Latin has evolved, and at the same time, perhaps, let's say you're reading Descartes in the original Latin and then you read it in the French, you'd see comparisons in the author's writing that cohesively connect dots from an archipelago of syntax into a more coherent constellation of pragmatism and semantics. And once you understand that linguistic connectivity between the archipelagos of information that surround us in every environment, you can start piecing together a system from those, whether it be a simple 2D coordinate system as per the classic Cartesian, or into a more coherent 3D Cartesian system, and build up Euclidean geometry into non-Euclidean geometry. And from there the world becomes more and more fascinating, especially once you start looking at it from so many perspectives, particularly marketing, because marketing enables us to think about it in not just the neuroscientific perspective via neuroimaging, as well as looking at that quantitative data with qualitative logic from neuroeconomics through the neurolinguistics of neurolinguistic programming and its relation with dialectical behavioural therapy, as well as, I'll be honest, law of attraction. I think it's a valid set of principles for configuring lifestyle choices, in the same way that any behavioural conditioning principle has to have a rooted identity. So it's less of it being an ideology, more of it an identity, because one of the themes I've been exploring recently is identity and narrative. So I'm going to have identity and narrative in a ratio, which I'll explain more in a moment, a ratio with ideology. It's always better to spell things correctly. Ideology and science, maybe? They're not really the same consistence. Identity and narrative with ideology and teachings? Teachings will work for now. Principle sticks. Okay, so as I was saying before, identity and narrative, ideology and teachings. So the idea in essence is that when we better understand how to encode data into a system, such as forming a cohesive narrative that is an emergent principle of our identity, via the linguistic principles such as morphology, phonology, pragmatics, semantics, and cohesive syntax that's coherently cohesive. Yep, coherently cohesive syntax. One of my encoding principles is alphabetizing, because it's an established system that I can incorporate into a larger system and trust that it will be scalable, temporally scalable. So for instance, theoretically, in a billion years' time, if we're all living in the cloud, the system that I started now will be scalable into whatever digital system that has survived that long. If I choose to be alive for a billion years, I could imagine after the first 700 million you might find some repetition. Of course, repetition can actually provide scope for fun when you know how to do it correctly. Anyway, so I found linguistic syntax combined with mathematical syntax to be a terrific base to learn everything else from. The reason I found that really helpful was from reading Chris Langan's Cognitive Theoretical Model of the Universe, CTMU, which, if you're not familiar with, is worth a read. The principle of it is basically reality is a linguistic environment. So that everything you do, from the kinesics of gesticulation, or your posture, or your eye contact, or facial expressions, which to me you could reductively look at from unconscious eye movements and skin galvanization, electrodermal behaviour, and how would I put it? Intentional and unintentional behaviour, is because linguistics serves as a cohesive unifier. It provides the basis for everything else. So for instance, body language can work in consistency with having, let's say if I move my left hand up, you could argue that that's a syllable of a word, or the clause of a sentence, as the rest of my body language, because it could be that the word I'm expressing is just hello, or it could be the hello, my name is Malcolm. Now obviously this is more specific in sign languages, however the unconscious kinesic expressions that all humans have by virtue of being alive is something that I think has its own economic validity, because once you recognise the economic validity of a human being simply by virtue of existence, you recognise that we inhabit an economic system that is part of a market, which is part of a society, which is part of a theory, which no matter what skill you're looking at the information from, it has to have a cohesive narrative for it to be interpretable, for it to be manageable, for it to be survivable. So, somebody's mentioned the word Discord. You're going to have to tell me, I've heard of Discord and I've used it a handful of times. If you wouldn't mind just elaborating first. Hello. So once you grant the principle of linguistics as a cohesive unifier of principles, then you can start looking at the universe from that perspective, because as I've mentioned in earlier episodes, I'm a firm supporter of simulation theory being a possibility, as well as, quite honestly, I feel that simulation theory's possibility does not deem it to be mutually exclusive with the premise of evolution or quantum mechanics or string theory or many other ideas that we have, such as CTMU and geometric field theory. I want to say it's Eric Weinstein's version, because if we live in a simulation, it's entirely possible that the simulation we're inhabiting was designed in such a way that we discover those specific models of reality, either as an idea for explaining what we call cosmology, or as an ontological premise that, okay, this is just my projective idea of how I interpret existence to manifest itself as a continuation of my sensory systems receptors collecting data from its environment and communicating that to my bioelectrochemical substrate, which doubles as a biopsychosocial substrate, which connects together in such a way that it makes it easier for the data to be parsed from initial perceptive uptake into throughput of cognition, of computation, until the output is communicable to anybody around us. So, bioelectrochemical and biopsychosocial. For anybody who's interested, one of the things I do when I study is I write in multiple colours. So in my small book I use two colours and a monochromatic. So blue, green, red, and blue, red, green, red, blue, red, green, red as an alternating pattern, and black as a unifier because of the four colour theorem. And when I'm writing in my A4 book I use 10 colours plus black, and I do that in a different imbrication which starts with purple because of the chess.com's grading rubric coinciding pretty much with the electromagnetic spectrum, until I found out that ultraviolet vibrated faster than everything else. So I figured, well, that's a place to start, and then it goes pink, dark red, red, orange, yellow, dark green, bright green, dark blue, bright blue. And having that as a consistent idea then further encodes the data in a systematized manner, so that eventually, as with alphabetizing or triples or prime numbers are one of my favorites, I've recently been looking into more number sequences such as the Fibonacci sequence and the Lucas sequence, as well as thinking about ratios, all prime numbers specifically, as various encoding mechanics, encoding dynamics. It's one of the two, and as I get better at, as I develop my vocabulary to be inclusive of more fields, of more vocabulary, of more vernaculars from different fields, I'm getting better at realising what the most pertinent language is in all of those fields, as well as having a jolly good time and getting a really strong basis for my undergraduate dissertation. So what I'm planning to do now is go back a moment and correctly assess this game of chess, because this is part of the system. So whilst this doesn't seem like a cohesive narrative for anybody listening, for me it's actually, of this section of this series, this is the most cohesive communication I've had so far, so we're going to consider that progress in of itself, and remember that what I'm doing is learning by doing, and that the various ideas from linguistics, mathematics, neuroscience, physics, psychology, as well as sociology all the way through systems thinking, and many other ideas including computer science, which I'll be honest is probably my weakest area of knowledge, however I still find utterly fascinating as a topic, is the more general I feel I can understand everything, the more cohesive my specificity becomes, which I don't think sounds like a juxtaposition. It doesn't feel like a juxtaposition to me. It's a matter of, when I encode things really holistically, it's easier to find what reductions are specific to my interpretation versus what reductions are a result of a cognitive bias. So when I say my interpretation is post-cognitive bias, I mean it more as an interpretation linguistic form of intentionally correct conversion of data instead of just continuing with an existing model. Because one of the principles of so I have this what I call mathematical multi-algorithm is basically a systems thinking language which is inclusive of various ideas such as Gresham's law and identifying when, okay, if that's the wrong way to go, how wrong is the wrong way and why is it wrong, and then reverse engineering from that, as well as figuring out like the placebo effect, placebo distribution, placebo effect Pareto distributions, as well as the Matthew principle and the Peter principle. There's many more to them. I have them written down. I'll speak about them more in a future podcast because I feel they're really helpful for establishing an idea of what is the best way to go about things. And as you can see from the style of checkmate here being very aesthetic, to me that's a correct interpretation of Komodo's algorithm, because as you can see, I haven't even moved that rook there, but the idea is I've sacrificed both knights, have 3 pawns apiece, have the queen in a 2-1 pattern here with the bishops, as well as the squares of 3, boom, 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 dark to light. That to me is an indication of the ratio patterns which Komodo functions upon, which are part of how I generally try to encode all data in my day-to-day life. So that went quite well. Accuracy of 95.1, which I need to document in my spreadsheet, which, oh, that's actually a really, really good idea. So we're going to just do that now instead of, this is something I've learned to be very, very helpful for anybody who wants to become more productive, more productive, or just generally better at anything in your life. If it takes less than 5 minutes, do the thing. If it takes less than 20 minutes, it's probably best to do the thing. If it takes more than an hour, pick a time and do the thing. And I find that the better I get at episodes, at just doing the thing instead of over planning the thing or thinking about the thing or discussing I'm going to the thing, any of that, it just helps. And I feel that for people who've been in a similar position to me, as I've had quite a rough start of life, which honestly I don't really want to rehash right now, but it boils down to having been so low that I wasn't really sure if I was going to be alive and or employed and or imprisoned and or such a bunch of other stupid stuff from being a reckless child that just, I can blame all sorts of things, but at the end of the day what I've learned is being accountable for my actions and accepting that whilst there might have been things beyond my control, I still made decisions in response to them. So those decisions I now have to accept are my responsibility. And it seems like a really obvious thing to people who haven't been that low in life or haven't suffered the consequences. But it really does help to have a system. And the better your system, the better you can work and result from that. So right now I'm continuing my spreadsheet and adding a few more details. The details being the scoring from this round of chess. And we can make that prettier later, but the idea is I got that there. No, that won't happen. Just stop that. And there that. Da-da-da. I know this seems somewhat off topic, but it's something I should have done earlier. And as I said, if I do it now, it's done. And we can all get on with our lives. Okay, so grand. Okay. 25.1 0 0 0 0 9 2 6 9 0 0. Cool. Now, as I was saying, so we're 36 minutes. Okay, to summarise what I've been talking about so far, marketing student studying his dissertation, focused on behavioural conditioning as a result of ratios, looking at neuroeconomics and various other applications of neuroscience, consumer neuroscience, pardon me. Interested in the mathematical perspective. Today I've been researching an article that was talking about nudge theory and its ability to influence and resistance to it, which I'll continue reading tomorrow. I had 2 hours less because of buses, because cars getting replaced. My girlfriend's arriving home from a weekend away, so spending the evening there, so that's an hour less. So hopefully 3 hours more than usual will mean I can finish the article and do the various bits of studying I would do usually, which would be writing. The details of that are essentially, I'm going to continue trying my best to read at least an article a day. The aim is to read 1 article a day and write 3 A4 pages about it in whatever form they come out. Sometimes it's bullet points, sometimes it's reference noting, sometimes it's paragraphs, sometimes it's an amalgamation of things, sometimes just a semantic network, which I would, depending on how you understand the concept of semantic network, it can be very artistic, and it can be, I have to really show you one for it to make a lot of sense. I've got any in this book, or was it earlier? It might have been that book. I'll hold it up to the camera and see if it's interpretable enough. Might have been after that. Let's go before that. Oh, hang on, was that one? No, that's just maths. That's might have been a different book. Oh, hang on, what was that? That was something else. That's okay. I don't seem to have. Oh, hang on. I might have started in later in the book than I thought. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so for instance, when I say semantic network, I mean this sort of drawing out ideas, piecing them together in various bracket structures. So it can feel very artsy, and then as I might do more of these in the future, but they're all quite generalised ideas of how to represent information. So some of them, for instance, the one to my right here has got various chess world champions in the years just at these sides. So basically a lot of this was to do with trying to reverse engineer a chess engine, and it was useful to visualise things. And I thought, well, if I can assign, basically placeholder labels for each of the mechanisms at work to describe the dynamics, which I think I'm using those words correctly, is I might as well choose placeholder terms that are viable continuations of other study systems. So I was, like linguistics, mathematics, neuroscience, and then morphology, phonology, pragmatics, semantics, syntax, and then various operations. So if you go PEMDAS route, it would be parentheses, exponentiation, extraction, logarithms, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. If it's neuroscience, it might go to neuroanatomy and just like charting out various areas, just as a matter of efficiency. So I feel working in that sense is a very representative idea of how, is there a thing here, of how studying can become a really holistic experience, which I feel might be stating the obvious. It's also a very helpful way to learn how you learn, because once we understand how we best understand the world, it becomes much easier for us to behave in a way that responds to the world constructively instead of feeling overloaded, which I'm sure we've all felt at some point in our lives. It's not the most unique feeling, and that's not to sound disparaging of the unique emotions we all go through in life. It's more a reflection of, okay, yeah, something in your life has happened that sucks. So what? And I don't mean that dismissively. I mean, okay, so something that in your life that sucks has happened. What are you going to do about it? Yeah, just how are you going to choose to respond to the difficulty in your life? Because that choice, which ultimately is a choice, is one of the few things that any of us truly has control over in our lives, which is part of the inspiration for my dissertation being written on behavioural conditioning as a result of ratios, ratio-based behavioural conditioning as a result of marketing. Thankfully, I don't have to find a formalised title until, I think, after summer. The point stands is because a digital platform has become so consistently ingrained into every aspect of pretty much everybody's lives, it's almost impossible to function in the modern Western world without using a digital platform daily, whether it's simply the application of a smartphone as whether it's simply the application of a smartphone because that's how you get around life. Or a laptop with internet connection, or anything more specific such as a generative AI or social media or a streaming service. The ubiquitousness of these devices as part of functioning in a Western society has gone so far beyond optional that I think the conditioning results of it are, to me, that's indicative of the king submitting. So, as far as I can tell, Komodo recognises I'm winning, which, if they haven't played before with this engine, is kind of what it does. Okay, I've been on quite a few tangents, with a few hypotheses coming back to the hypotenuse. I feel I'm in a different wavelength now. So, let's continue here and see how we get on. So if I go there, you can only go there, but then I can go here, but then you can go here, and then I can go... Don't. Don't, because that. I know this doesn't seem like a particularly difficult level of chess, but I'm trying to get it as perfect as possible, because the more precise my syntax as I communicate with the computer here, the better reflection of my ability to encode its data as part of my idea of systematization. So to speak more specifically to what I'm writing my dissertation on, the behavioural conditioning effects can be likened to businesses effectively becoming social engineering organisations. Because if you think about, let's take ChatGPT for example, there's also companies such as Claude and Copilot, DeepSeek, Gemini, Grok, and Meta AI, so that's 7 total. Each of those will have their own particular vocabularies and various principles of logic, to put it one way. And because of that, it means that everything we as a society do with these devices is going to be a point of training data. We have to also acknowledge that everything we're doing with these devices is teaching those devices how we want to interact with them, which, very simply put, is a form of self-referential social encoding. It's behavioural conditioning on such a large scale that we're teaching ourselves how we want to be taught. This is why law of attraction ties into this so well, as so in the same sense that dialectical behavioural therapy, cell assembly theory, and neurolinguistic programming. Thank you, Clicking Ankle, for giving me a audio reinforcement cue. Is the reason these work so well together is precisely because every behaviour that every human does, whether conscious or unconscious, is representative of a behavioural conditioning element. When you wake up in the morning, the first thing you say to yourself is the first thing you are encoding in yourself. And the first thing you're encoding in yourself becomes the pattern of the first thing you do when you wake up and every day. Because if you teach yourself to do that, let's say, well, that's a really interesting thing, because you go as far back as developmental psychology. And if you start looking at it from that level of depth, as well as technology influencing kids at that deeper level, it's the idea of businesses becoming social engineering organisations, developmental psychology, neuromarketing, social engineering, systems thinking, and just, there we go, technology. So, as I said before, one of my encoding principles is working in prime numbers. So I was trying to think of something that was alphabetically consequent to the words I was saying here, and going from the first word of them all, developmental, neuromarketing, social systems, technology, was reasonably on point, and continue the sequence. And whilst that seems a very semantic differentiation, the longer you train systems thinking and develop your own methods of speaking with yourself, the more coherent the simplest prompts will work. So one of the principles of advertising is the idea that adverts and advertising strategy can generally be grouped into has 3 subcategories. So if you consider advertising as a subset of marketing, the subsets of advertising are informative advertising, persuasive advertising, and reminder advertising. And those 3 principles, as they sound, essentially providing consumer with information. So for instance, the first time you encode the data or show the advert, you're letting them know what's going on. You're beginning that brand narrative. You're shaping the brand identity, because first impressions matter, as I'm sure we all know. And that's how you develop an idea of what brand resonance is on first interpretation. It's first contact, right? Same idea as first contact with a new species. So when you think about that from a developmental psychology perspective, the first time they ever interface with any sort of these digital platforms, whether it be generative AI or social media or streaming services or what goes beyond those? Smartphones, really? Would be the first time they interact with smartphones or any sort of tablet device, as opposed to a book, whether they're reading it or writing it, you're influencing their development in a way that will reshape their development, which when you scale up to society, developmental psychology is essentially the reductionist idea of evolutionary psychology. And I've been thinking about that for years. Developmental ratio evolutionary. In the same way that psychology is a reductive version of sociology as a holistic counterpart. So if you think about I'm always trying to make sure to integrate new words. So if you think about the endogenous behavioural patterns that children have from the very first time they encounter any sort of cohesive language beyond simple perception, that concentration on reading a word. The first time they ever do that, whether it be in the context of reading like a Dr. Seuss book, or Hungry Caterpillar, or Harry Potter, when that's your first book and you read it well, good job. It changes the way we develop. And because it changes the way we develop on a long enough time scale, a long enough timeline, it changes the way we evolve. And I've said this before many times with people, maybe not on the podcast, is I feel psychologically we're almost forcing an evolutionary change to happen faster than our biology is perhaps possible of, as well as, compatible with. So simply because it might be possible does not necessarily mean it's a good idea, in the sense that I'm sure many of you are aware of dopaminergic systems that are exploited by marketers. They deliberately leverage these biochemical responses because they know that so one of the spreadsheets I keep track of is dedicated to what's the first 7 hits that come up on my YouTube feed. Because if I keep track of that every day, I can get an idea. I listen to basically nowadays the same sort of motivational videos, just on repeat all day long, just to keep me in the headspace I want to be. Because that to me is a practical use of these technologies which function as behavioural conditioning devices. Because everything we do is a behavioural conditioning effect, has a behavioural conditioning effect. Whether you're listening to somebody, or you're reading something, or you're speaking with a person, or you're typing something or writing something, whatever conduit of language your interlocution takes place through, it's still a behavioural conditioning idea. It's, from law of attraction, it would be described as a reflection of self, which in an artistic principle, that's one of the most classic Eminem lyrics I can think of, is from Sing for the Moment, of that music is reflection of self. It really is, because whether you're writing lyrics, or you're playing drums or guitar or piano, you're still expressing something within you that can be traced back to an emotional feeling. Any musician, I'm sure any artist really has been through this, whether you're sketching something in a notepad, or you're sculpting, or you view sports as an art. For me, I can very much understand how. So I've done many sports in my life. I did swimming as a young kid. I've played football, rugby, skateboarding, powerlifting, basketball, lot of bouldering. I was professional. I was an instructor, make that clear. I held the Scottish deadlift record for a while. That was cool. For age group, which was under 20s. And now I'm very much into martial arts. Is all of these sports, I mean, martial arts is a term right there, it's all have these artistic qualities regardless of how academically you take the athletic pursuit, because as with chess, is it an art, is it a science, is it a sport? Well, ultimately they're all the same thing from a holistic perspective, in the sense of it's just a matter of how you go about doing it. And sometimes when you're testing a theory for the very first time, you have to go on such a fundamental level of intuition that you might as well call it art. And there are many mathematicians who describe math as art, which I'm not sure of a more scientific process than art, with the vigorously rigorous application of proofing of theorems. And I think the further you get into these ideas of multimodal communication as a data encoding system, the easier it becomes to clarify what you mean. For instance, sometimes if you can describe it in a metaphor, I mean, analogizing has been a very useful tool for years. It's whether you're thinking about it in terms of analogies or simply with similes, when you can use language as a vessel to move an idea forward, you then, and that can even extend to kinesics, if you can body language your way through something. So for instance, my mother is French, and when I was younger speaking with my cousins, we spoke in a combination of French and English, which helped us improve at both languages, but the Franglish that resulted from those communications did have, hang on, let's go this way, or let's try that, or whatever we're trying to figure out at the time. Kinesics is a very important part of this, and when you don't have an established sign language that's known by the speakers of these other languages, having gesticulations as a commonality is very helpful. The thing is, though, those are still part of a biochemical system, which in marketing terminology is an economic property. Because it's an economic property, because everything for neuromarketing specifically, whether you've got somebody hooked up to an EEG, an electroencephalogram, or an fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, or an FNIRS, functional near-infrared functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, and functional near-infrared spectroscopy, because they've got different spatial and temporal resolutions, you get different data from all of them. The idea is that you can connect people to these devices and find out very, very quickly what they're actually capable of communicating, and what they actually, and how their intentions and behaviours connect. So in a study that I read recently, I can't remember the author right now, I've got it written down, thank you, notes. See, people, notes, spreadsheets, very helpful. Pardon me. It was journals, that one, by Yao and Wang, 2024, using neurodata to forecast aggregate consumer behaviour in neuromarketing, published in Journal of Consumer Behaviour. And so one of the things I found most interesting, I made a note of it there, was how quite specifically when people are speaking about their intention to continue with a service of any kind, is the data from the nucleus accumbens and dorsal medial lateral cortex signified the accuracy of the validity of their claims, really, because it found that people with the certain behaviours there, which I don't remember specifically, I'd have to look at the images to know more so precisely, was it revealed whether or not people were consistent with the language that they'd expressed their intention of commitment with. So if neuromarketers can then devise from that information whether or not people are going to be consistent with the word, then to me that speaks of integrity as a principle of marketing strategy. It is an economic property. It's essentially everything can be reduced to economic properties. Thank you, other viewer. It's because everything can be reduced to economic properties. because we are in an economy, which is a market, which is part of society, which is part of reality, which is a theory, it all essentially can be seen as everything you do is affecting your prosperity, whether in the microcosmic scale of whether you sip water first thing in the morning, or you're chasing the hair of the dog because you've got a nasty hangover, or those choices matter, they add up. And I do judge people's decisions sometimes. I do my best not to. I feel that sometimes judgment can actually be a very effective tool for helping people correct their behaviour, and withholding judgment in the interest of compassion can be helpful for some people. Sometimes you need to let people say, no, that's wrong. It's not just wrong in the sense of I disagree with it, I feel it's wrong for you, and I feel it's wrong for society. And that, at the premise, is what politics is all about. So the idea of having a judgment-free environment, and I'm not quite sure why I veered into this train of thought, so just bear with me, folks, is the idea of being non-judgmental. It's the same principle of having unconditional love. The idea of unconditional love is the idea that if you take that to its literal extreme, that is unconditionally loving somebody who would willingly rape you, or steal all your things, or physically assault you in other ways. Unconditional love is a ridiculous term. I am completely behind the idea of being supportive and speaking to people when they go through difficult things, and in certain cases being forgiving. At the same time, it's very, very naive almost to believe in this idea of unconditional love without understanding that there must be exceptions to that rule for it to be a healthy relationship. Now, the term healthy relationship surely has an enormous degree of variance in how we define it. The point is, I think we can all agree the examples I gave are very clear ideas of what I would assume, I bloody well hope every human agrees is a healthy relationship. So, from the idea of judgment and integrity as economic principles, it's that same idea of, in an economic system, everything has merit, everything has value, which means everything can be quantified and be given a value and therefore hierarchized, which means it has a taxonomic placement, which means, yes, some people's kinesic behaviour is more valuable than others. Now, you could simply reduce that to the idea of fluency in sign language as an asset in the job market if you're an interpreter, or you simply want to work with the deaf community. In the same sense that if you have strong body language when you're communicating, and you can gesture this way and think about this and know not to do that to your employers, and maybe think a bit more positively about stuff, you'd be able to become more employable. It's a very simple metric, and same with it. If you're in the dating market, perhaps you want to cross your legs a certain way to signal interest if you're aware of ideas of body language matching. In the same sense of, you probably don't want to slouch at the table and just, I'm kind of there. Like, if you're genuinely interested in the person, display that interest as wholeheartedly as you can. And I really feel it's an extension of the idea of how you do one thing is how you do everything. Because if you can maintain a level of consistency throughout all of your behaviours that speaks to the highest version of yourself that you could possibly envision, you'll get there. That is what the law of attraction is supposed to be about. It's the same idea of how dialectical behavioural therapy is supposed to work. It's how neurolinguistic programming is supposed to work. And the validity of these claims is entirely reinforced by cell assembly theory, and even earlier than that from behavioural conditioning, whether you go through Pavlov's dogs or Skinner's rats or even Milgram's experiments with electrozapping. Behavioural conditioning has been around for so many years, and I really need to find specific dates for Pavlov, Skinner and Milgram and Zimbardo as well. Chronology, Pavlov, etc. It's that same idea that when I was speaking earlier about ratios and how they affect behavioural conditioning, and I am trying to develop a more academic tone in these conversations because I feel it will be helpful for when I'm studying more specifically. Sometimes, though, I just need to let my mind go, as I'm sure you've all experienced before. You just have to express the idea how it's coming to mind, and you can refine the oil that comes out of your mouth later. So think of it as, because all elements of communication hardly, must be reducible to a principle of intention, which I feel is conducive with the idea of identity and narrative as a continuation of that intention. When you communicate to somebody, whatever you're saying to them, when you speak with a person, you're telling them what you want them to perceive of you. Oh dear, I missed a tactic apparently. Oh, let's see the checkmate. When you're communicating with a person, why on earth would the rook move to the side? So, why would you move a pawn? Oh, because the knight, right, yeah, I see. So, for instance, right there, one of the things I'm doing with my behavioural encoding is that I'm treating my middle finger as a rubric between my index and my ring finger as my dominant fingers. So, for instance, if I'm pointing at something, because pointing with middle fingers is, shall we say, culturally unacceptable. But pointing with pinky fingers, it's an interesting idea how these two, how this pair and this pair seem to have different societal interpretations, because in most cultures, if you point at somebody with your middle finger, it's considered rude, and I've noticed that sometimes pointing at pinky fingers can be interpreted as rude, although less so. Pointing at index fingers is very commonly accepted. Pointing at ring fingers, people don't seem to take offence to it. So, as an idea of that, when I noticed if it's my middle or pinky finger doing something, I'm assigning that a locally negative valence just as a principle of differentiation, and my index and ring fingers having a positive lens, so that I can consciously correct those behaviours and move closer towards the objective. In this case, checkmate. If it's jiu-jitsu, securing their submission. If it's at school, it's getting a first-class honours grade, ideally as close to 97 as possible. I'm working on a prime system, so 71 bare minimum, then 73, next threshold 79, then 83, then 89. And if I'm, whatever behaviour I'm doing is to, what is the best I've done so far, how close can I get to it, either repeating it or surpassing it. That's literally all the system has to do. And then it's a matter of defining specifics of it. So, I'm nearly finished today's episode. We very, very close to finishing this game's review. I'm going to try and stay closer to... Well, that's the tricky thing. It's part of staying on topic is really, really helpful, because it is the final intention of what I'm doing, and I want to be able to speak at length about all this stuff. Conversely, when I speak how I want to speak, I knew it was the night. I had a feeling it was the night, I should say. When I speak in this rapid fire, almost mind wandering sort of way, I feel far more free flowing, and I tend to connect ideas in a way that might not necessarily come across as academically, what's the term? It's not necessarily the language you use to write an academic paper, or if you were, in this context it's absolutely fine, and then the idea is what matters, and provided I'm understanding the ideas, and you're all understanding the ideas, I've accomplished the task at hand, and accomplishing the task at hand is obviously the point of the task at hand. So, I will endeavour to be more academically adhering with my language in future. I'm going to continue developing the systems that I've been developing and figuring out how behavioural conditioning is effectively becoming a social engineering device, because businesses have operationalised behavioural conditioning via marketing. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for our viewers, for everybody who's been in the chat today. Really appreciated it. If anybody has any questions, feel free to either post them in the Twitch chat, post a comment on YouTube. If you enjoyed today, then, you know, link it to your friends, leave a comment, you know, however you want to express it, subscribe to the channel. Yeah, grand. Thanks very much for watching. I've got many other things to do today. Yeah, keep studying, training, working, and living life.